If we find ourselves with a hunger that nothing else in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world.
Hi everybody, we're in week 6 of Mountain Messages, and today we're having a look at what Jesus teaches, thinks about sex and sexual temptation. And certainly the thing I love about the Bible is that these practical issues that are real life issues, Jesus doesn't conceal or sidestep. He brings them to the light and he speaks into them. And so we'll spend a few moments exploring this topic. It's an interesting topic. There's many little alleys and byways, and I won't cover most of them, but certainly just to put some principles in place for us this morning. And just recently, my younger brother arrived at my house, and as he was leaving, he told a very humorous little story of how the night before he had spent a couple minutes with his middle son, and they'd spoken about, as he called it, the birds and the bees. And I said, "Oh yeah, how did that go?" And he had a twinkle in his eye. He says, "Yeah, it was very interesting and awkward speaking about these things." And at the end of the conversation, his son looked at him with a bit of terror in his eyes and said, "Geesh, Dad, I don't think I'm going to be able to sleep tonight." And we were chuckling about that. But the more I thought about it, I thought, that's the way it's meant to be. The unveiling of this arena and the talking into it, the shaping of the sexual arena for young people should happen between fathers and sons, between mothers and daughters. It should happen within the family construct. As we look at the world today, certainly the world is a very fallen and complicated place, and much of our shaping doesn't happen within the family. It happens on the corridors of schools. It happens in the media, social media. We're shaped, and our ideology, what seems to be normal, isn't actually according to the Bible, but it's become normal because of the sentiment of the world around us. And so we've really got two challenges, I think, in the world today. The first is that the world idolizes sex. Wherever you go, it's half naked, it's appealing, it's luring in, it's on the billboards, it's very easily accessible and needs to be managed with young people and with old. It's not just a young people challenge. I think the stat that comes to mind is the one that says the porn industry produces 4 times the amount of content to Hollywood. And Hollywood isn't in the clear in terms of what they produce in the sexual arena. And so the world idolizes sex. It's all around us. People talk about sexuality as if it's the football game with the same passion and openness. The second challenge is that the world has distorted sex. And so sexual identity, the persuasions of some that have started out in this way and now are looking in a new arena, it can be quite traumatic. And it's certainly, everyone has a free choice in this world today. Now, one of the things that I think is important to consider when we look at these things is, where's our starting point? And the starting point for us here at One Life Church has to be the Bible, and we want to be shaped by what the Bible has to say about these things. When we look at the world today, I don't think much of what the world says about sexuality reflects God's heart from the Bible. So the bottom line, and this is certainly the first comment in your study notes today, is that God created sex. It wasn't a man-made construct. God created sex. Secondly, it's to be enjoyed. That's fantastic. It's not prudish. It's not something to conceal. It's not something that no one talks about. It's to be enjoyed and spoken into openly. But the enjoyment is within the covenant of marriage, of the marriage relationship. Now, maybe to illustrate for a few moments, I've got this knife here with me. This is looks like a bit of a weapon. This was a knife that my dad owned from the early 80s, 1982, 1983. And when he passed away, I inherited this giant steak knife. He worked in the Woolworths meat market, and this was one of the tools that he used. When I inherited it, I looked after it, I polished it, I sharpened it, and my sons, the one day when I came home, I noticed they'd taken this knife and it was lying in the garden. It was very damaged. What I realized was that they'd taken this knife and they'd used it as a panga and they were butchering some object on top of a brick, and it was chipped, it was dirty, it was damaged. Of course, I was a bit traumatized and a little bit uptight with my sons as to how they'd used this instrument. For me, that's a little bit like the sexual arena. God intended sex for a particular space, and when it's used right and when it's adopted in the right manner, in the right context, it's beautiful and it's effective. When it's used in the wrong way, it can be very damaging and distorting. Now, the text for today is Matthew 5, verse 27 to 30. It says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell." Now, what is Jesus doing here? Is he clamping down? Is he constricting? Is he becoming ultra legalistic? Well, we've got to remember that the Sermon on the Mount is really about upgrade. It's really about issues of the heart. What Jesus did was he looked back and leant on their system of teaching and their way of doing life, which was the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not be angry. And these were things that they were very au fait with and familiar with. Now, Jesus says, actually, committing adultery, that's more of a destination. It's like a big bad sin. And when you end up there, there's lots of shame and guilt attached to it. But he says, in essence, and this is me paraphrasing, that is a destination. But what you've ceased to realize is that there's a whole lot of markers along that journey that you've just ridden right through. And so Jesus says it starts a lot earlier than just committing adultery. Actually, if you lust in your heart, if you undress a woman, if your mind is unfruitful in this way, it's akin to committing adultery. And so Jesus upgrades the old covenant, the law, and says there's a new law. And this is issues of the heart that Jesus is getting to. And this brings us to our next statement. Jesus does not condemn sexual desire, even when that desire is stirred by unexpected situations or unwelcome temptations. But when we deliberately rule our sexual desire by objectifying people, we produce in ourselves a warped view of sex and people. And see, what Jesus is teaching here is that sexual desire is real, but he's pointing to temptation. And what do we do with temptation? And how do we manage it? And what's the source of temptation? Is there a way that we can eradicate temptation? James says this in James 1 verse 13. He says, "When tempted, no one should say, 'God is tempting me,' for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, gives birth to death." And so out of this scripture, there are three thoughts around temptation and sin. The first is this: there's a difference between sin and temptation. Many times, we've just been tempted, but it feels like we're sinning. And James is establishing that there's a difference between the two. Martin Luther said this: "You cannot keep birds from flying over your head, but you can keep them from building a nest in your hair." In other words, temptation is going to fly to you at every point of your life, but it's up to you. It's a decision as to whether you allow it to rest and then build a nest and become a real problem to eradicate. Recognize temptation. It's got to do with what I watch, where I go, what I listen to, and who I spend my time with. And the second thing we draw is that temptation can lead to sin. We've got to be aware of that. And so we're not casual around temptation, saying, actually, this will never happen to me, I'll never give in to it, or I'm stronger. Actually, temptation, it's the breeding ground for sin to take root in our life. Now, one wise man many years ago, he said this when talking about lust and the opposite sex. He said, it's not the first look that counts, it's the second and the third. In other words, the first look, if you notice a beautiful woman or a really good-looking man and it catches your attention, that's like the temptation. But lustful thinking is where I begin to entertain and where I begin to look a second and a third time, and my eyes are transfixed in that direction. Very helpful. The third point to make is that our sin, when it takes root, eventually leads to death. The wages of sin is death. Something begins to die within us as sin takes its root. This is a very interesting topic, very complex in some regards, and yet a lot of freedom when we understand what Jesus is saying and when we use the Bible as our base. I trust that this has stimulated you. All the best with your discussion. No doubt it will have a lot of energy. God bless.